This is part 4 of this series called A Lesson on Factoring, and in this series you're going to learn about reverse FOIL. So if you haven't done so already, go ahead and print out the class notes and the class practice for 14.6. When you're factoring, you have to stop before you work and examine what it is you want to factor. First, is there a greatest common factor? If so, you factor it out unless there are perfect squares or perfect cubes involved, and then you make sure you're not factoring out something that will change the perfect square or perfect cube. Next, you look at the special cases. If there are two terms, ask yourself, is it a difference of squares or a difference of cubes or a sum of cubes? And then use those formulas which we covered in the last video. If it's three terms, you ask, is it a perfect square trinomial? And then if so, you use that formula which we covered in the last video. The next thing you ask is there a coefficient in front of the x squared term that is 1? In other words, you don't see anything there because it is 1. If that is true, then you're going to do what we're going to do in this video, which is reverse FOIL. If that is not true, if there's a number like 4 or -2 or something, then you have to use grouping, and we'll cover that in the next video. On the next page, you'll see a bunch of problems, and in our first video, we identified the problems that fit various situations. The ones we identified for reverse FOIL were number 3, not number 4 because it's a perfect square trinomial, and then not anything else until we get to number 10, which looks a little tricky, but we'll end up using reverse FOIL. And then we're going to look at 12 and see if we can use reverse FOIL on that one. I'll use number 3 to illustrate how to use reverse FOIL. I'm going to show you one method because I don't want to confuse you. There are a lot of methods and you're welcome to use any of them, but the one that people find the easiest is this method where you draw a table off to the side and you put this number first, -6. You put it as the column heading for your first column, and then you put this number second, the coefficient of the middle term, which in this case is -5. You want two numbers that multiply together to give you -6 and add together to give you -5. And you could try all the different combinations of this, but to reduce the combinations, you can ask yourself, what two kinds of numbers will give me a -6? And the answer is, it won't be two negatives because two negatives multiply to give you a positive, and it won't be two positives because they multiply to give you a positive. So it has to be a positive and a negative. So you're going to have two numbers that are positive or negative, and then you have to add them together to get a negative number, a -5. So what are those two numbers going to be like? Which one's going to be larger? And in order to get a -5 when you add them together, the larger number has to be negative. So that reduces the amount of combinations you can try. And I'm going to write down all of the combinations. And so we're not going to write down 6 and -1 because we already decided that the larger number has to be negative. So we're going to write down -6 and 1. And the next combination we can try is -3 and 2. You wouldn't need to try that because you should be adding as you go, and -6 plus 1 is -5, and that's the combination you want. Just for grins, we're going to add -3 and 2 and show that that's -1, and so that won't work. So we've identified that -6 and 1 will work. Now all we have to do is write two sets of parentheses, and our variable goes first, and then we write the numbers, -6 plus 1, and that's our answer. That's factored. So you can check it out using reverse FOIL. Using FOIL. FOIL says you multiply the first terms together, then the outer terms, then the inner terms, then the last term, and then you combine like terms, and you see that this result is the same as what we started with, so we have checked our answer. The next problem we identified was number 10, and so what we want are two numbers that multiply to give us negative 20 and add to give us 8. So we write our table and we look for two numbers. To multiply to get a negative number, they need to be a positive and a negative, and to add to give us a positive number, then the positive would have to be larger. Now say we started with 5 and negative 4. That multiplies to negative 20, but it adds to negative 1, so that won't work. So let's try 10 and negative 2. Well, that multiplies to negative 20 and adds to 8, so that'll work. So then we write our two sets of parentheses with the b variable first, and then we just fill in with these numbers. So we write plus 10 and minus 2, and then you can check that with FOIL. Okay, number 12, we're going to look at this. First, we see something odd here. So we're going to look for greatest common factor, and in this case it's d minus 3. And we did this on the greatest common factor video. What we're left with is d plus 7 plus d minus 1, which gives us 2d plus 6. And then we can factor out the 2 there. Okay, and then we don't have a trinomial to worry about. Everything's factored, so we don't use reverse FOIL there. So now looking at your class practice sheet for 14.6, go through and circle the numbers that you think you might want to use reverse FOIL. And be careful not to circle any that are perfect square trinomials. Okay, you should have only circled number 4, because number 5, while it has a coefficient of 1 outside the k² term, it is a perfect square trinomial, so we can just use the formula for that, although it would work with reverse FOIL. Okay, so let's look at number 4. We want two numbers that multiply together to give us negative 35 and add together to give us 2. So see if you can find those numbers. Okay, the numbers that are correct are 7 and negative 5. They multiply to negative 35 and add to 2. So what do you do next? Go ahead and factor this trinomial. Alright, now that you've factored it, it should look like this: n plus 7, n minus 5. And then be sure to FOIL your answer to make sure it matches what you started with. And that is the end of part 4 on reverse FOIL. Now let's continue on to the video on grouping.